say typical day, not typical school day, right? Like think about the weekend.
We have to put all of it in?
Yeah.
I didn't do all that.
Give you guys the opportunity to talk about this with each other, and then we're going to talk about it a little bit together. Before we do that, some people are like, why are we writing about our style? Like, why do you care what I wear on a Saturday? So, we're going to make the connection between, like, your style, right? Like, something that you guys understand, okay? And author style itself. We're going to talk a little bit about that in a second. But before we do, like, some of you guys may have talked about author style in the past, some of you may not have. Some of you guys may have talked about it like at a 9th grade level, but we're going to be talking about it at a little bit higher level here. So, I want you guys to give yourself a rating. Does anybody recognize these people? Who these people are? In this situation it is. But these are the original members of Destiny's Child. Latoya Luckett was the original member of Destiny's Child. And then she got kicked out.
She got kicked out and then she came.
Yes. So this is before Michelle. Anyway, so what I want you guys to do is, on a scale of Latoya Luckett to Beyonce, where are you with author style? So let me explain this to you because this is like one of the first times we've done this. So, when you're talking about like Latoya Luckett, she's no longer in Destiny's Child, you're lost, right? Like if I say author style, like you have no idea what I'm talking about. When I say author style, you're like, okay, I can maybe tell you a little bit about like plot, style, I can define those things for you, but I don't know where it comes from. If you are over here, you would be like, I'm able to close read a passage for style, give you some evidence, and tell you how it like supports the overall meaning. By the end of today, a lot of you guys are going to be like in this area. Okay, our goal by the end of the unit is to like all be at like Beyonce level, and it's going to change every time we do it. Today it's just Destiny's Child, but you be like ready to evaluate like a whole work of an author's like a whole collection of authors' works, and be able to tell me like some things about their style. So take a second, and if you want to write down, this is Latoya, Michelle, Kelly Rowland, and Beyonce, and tell me which one it is. Not Fantasia. If you don't want to write down like Latoya to Beyonce, you can write 1 to 4. Okay, so just take a second and write that underneath your do now. Tell me where you're at.
Oh, which one we at?
Yep. Tell me which one you're at. Yep, write their name. And if you want to do 1 to 4, you can too. I'll know what you mean.
So I got the same way.
No.
Who are right there?
This one? Michelle Williams. Okay. So, what I want us to do now is going back to our do now. I want you to turn to the person next to you. And obviously. And I want you to talk about like what your style is. So turn to the person next to you, and I want you to discuss your style. Are you influenced by fashion trends? Okay, talk about that a little bit. So turn to the person next to you. We're going to talk about that for a minute, and we're going to come back together. Talk about that.
The person next to you, they love
You can tune to Oscar. Yeah, like for example.
I don't even. You can still look the same. I know that one. I was sitting there telling me, what pair of pants should I wear? We don't put it there. I thought it was funny. She was like, she didn't want to people back, and then she take everything. You need snaps up like take my bag. I'm like, girl, take it. You put it out there. It was all right. I came out by the body. I remember. Well, that's you bought those 2 weeks ago. I swear to God, I remember that. I don't even like them. No,
Alright guys, let's get your back together. So,
what's your style?
What's your style?
we're gonna talk about it a bring it back together. Thank you. I heard a lot of like interesting discussions around like how people choose what they wear in the morning, that type of thing. Does anybody want to share out what like them and their partner talked about? Let's hear back here. Oscar, what did you guys talk about back here in terms of style?
So it said that he used Latoya, or how do you say her name? Latoya.
Latoya, like you have no idea anything about style.
He said that he likes to wear diamonds like sweaters
Okay.
from Jimmy's.
So, does he go for brands then?
Yeah.
Other times? Okay, showy brands. Makes sense.
He's in the ring.
He likes to read here?
No.
I have no idea. Okay. How would someone else describe their style? Yeah.
Me and her had like a similar style. Like we just have like how we feel, because we're not about to sit here for like 4 hours looking for one outfit. Like I just wear the first thing I see. Y'all both crazy. Because I mean y'all both come out the room looking exactly the same. You're sitting in the bathroom for 4 hours. She do something.
That's too much. You shouldn't put your hair like that. She's talking about her.
So, here's the thing. When it comes to style, though, like that brings up a good point. It's like a lot of us have similarities, and some of us have differences, and you may completely disagree with how someone else like chooses to dress, or like how they like how much time they spend, right? Like those type of things. It's going to be different for different people, right? Like that's a very very good point. Yeah.
Oscar said he likes just like a known person.
I said he likes
Oh, yeah. He likes to stay at home. He said he doesn't like to go out.
Okay, got it. So, when it comes to this, it's like, okay, why are we talking about this? What we can do with our style is we can kind of make a connection, an analogy, back to author's style. Christian today is trying to like cut up on my style, which is going to be fun when we get into his, and the fact that he knows his uniform. We'll talk about that later. Anyway, so, underneath your do now, let's talk a little bit about some of these preliminary elements of style. We're going to take some notes. So, when we're talking about author's style,
So you want us to put this in our notes?
Yeah.
Or not even now?
in your notes. You're talking about the way an author, he or she, uses words to make an idea come alive, right? Like that's the way that we kind of like put it in our own words. It's the way that they're getting their idea across to us. The most important thing about this to remember is that it's not what is said, but it's how it's said. So we're not so much concerned with like the words themselves, like what's being said, but it's more so how the author's going about saying it. So there's lots of different techniques that an author uses to convey their style to us. Some of them include word choice, dialogue, tone, mood, and then sensory language. When I say sensory language, Royce, what do you think about?
Like stuff that's like it's kind of like you're making the story like really sound really good when you're using these nice words.
Okay, so story sounds really good. Give me a little bit more. Like, how does it sound good?
Like say if like there was this explicit like movie or something like
Okay.
that. And then like you put in a lot of nice little detail to it, and it just sounded real good.
Okay, so there's detailed language. One of the ways that we do this in terms of sensory language, if you think about it, is you think about those literary devices, right? So like imagery, all of those things that evoke our senses, right? That's where that word comes from. So anything that makes us is so detailed, to Royce's point, that it can make you picture it, it can make you feel it, like smell it, whatever it might be, right? Hear it, all of those good things. Yes?
So that can be used like in a scary story.
Yeah, totally, that would be good for a scary story, right? Like it puts you like where you can feel those feelings,
Yeah.
feeling all the feelings. Give us about like 10 more seconds. Alright, so, other ways that we think about style. These three, I think, are like the more interesting versions, right? We can talk about word choice, we can talk about like all those different things, and we will, tone, mood, that good stuff. But these are things that also impact style that we don't talk about as much. One being, so let's do it in shorthand, right? So one would be the time period, right? Like that influences the author's style. Yeah, so I want you to write like what you find most important about this. Like let's practice our shorthand skills here. So when we're talking about time period, thinking about last year in Miss Spratt's class, for those of you who were in Miss Spratt, like you guys read The Odyssey and Romeo and Juliet. Yes? Romeo and Juliet?
I read Romeo and Juliet.
Awesome. So, thinking about Romeo and Juliet, and then versus like some of you guys, I know in Miss Siski's class, read like The Hunger Games, right? How could you compare their styles? Dennis, what do you think? Like Romeo and Juliet versus The Hunger Games.
Hunger Games,
One is
man.
Wait,
I
so I
understand.
just watched that movie.
One is older.
Okay, one is older, and how would that impact the way that the author writes?
Oh, yeah. I know the writing is different, like it's
Older.
yeah, older.
Like,
Yes? Okay.
And the
I'm gonna
past.
challenge you guys to do a little bit more than that, because that's not enough. Just saying like older is true, right? Like we can look at the covers of those books and like tell when they came out and tell you like one is new, one is old. True. Okay, but what about like the actual book itself and the play itself makes us think about style? We'll go here and then here.
like, you know how Romeo and Juliet, they like wrote the story in like in a different like perspective, or like the way that they write it. They didn't use like Shaw, like how you know like a British accent. That's what I noticed when I read Mrs. Siski.
Okay, so the words themselves.
Yeah, and the way like they talk, they don't talk like us. They talk like casual, we can say.
No, they talk like they in the Bible.
Yeah.
They in the Bible.
Okay, I mean that's another fine reference, right? Like the style of speech, right? Like the dialogue itself is completely different. Like they weren't saying things like swag and
Like,
Who's still
really,
saying
Romeo and
What
Juliet.
are,
I still say that, okay? And Romeo and Juliet, alright. So like that's a huge difference, like the vocabulary language and like the words themselves on the page. Christian, I know you can't handle how cool your advisor is right now, but like get it together. Anyway, so that's a really, really good point, the actual words itself. What about what your point was gonna be, Rebecca?
I wasn't gonna talk about like how the story was written as like I was gonna talk about like what happened in the story. Like they both had like two different fights, but like in Romeo and Juliet they used like swords and stuff like that, but in like the Hunger Games they used like some crazy weapons, some high tech stuff. So like
Yes.
the different types of things that they use in the story.
Yeah, the actual story itself, right? Like the plot itself is gonna make some difference. Like you're not gonna read a story
Swords.
written
They
in
have
no.
They had guns too.
But they most definitely had in their Hunger Games weapons.
No,
They had.
they most definitely not. So like let's say about the fact, the point that she's making, okay, is like if you're gonna read a story today, like there's probably gonna be like some sort of smartphone in it, or potentially like a computer. If you're thinking about stories that written like a couple hundred years ago, they're not gonna have that technology. So like characters aren't gonna have those things, which is important. Okay, second piece of this is the level of language. So, to Josue's point, there can be different levels, right? Grand or elevated, there's gonna be plain, simple language versus more like flowery language. Or you might have like everyday language or proper language, right? Different ways for us to look at this. And then lastly is gonna be the quality of the language, right? So there's different ways that we can describe it. You don't have to write all those down. We're gonna talk about these together, but you can look at it from different perspectives, right? You're gonna read Romeo and Juliet, and it's more poetic, romantic. Whereas you might read one of the books, like one of the articles in our textbook, or even like a speech, and it's gonna be more like journalistic, straightforward, and academic, right? Like there's different types of language we have to think about. All right. So what I want you guys to do is in your book, open up to page 22. We're gonna go through this part together. On page 22, there's like a quick passage, it's right from the Monkey's Paw, which we've read. And I chose this one just because it's something we've seen before, and to model it, we don't have to like look at the whole story. So, looking on actual page 22, you'll see that there's a review of plot and like the different elements of plot. I want you to take a second, and with your neighbor, I want you to look back over those. Okay, if you want to look at them yourself. But take a second, read back through those different plot and plot devices. On page 22, read back through the plot and plot devices on the left side of the page, Christian.
I see.
Thank you. No, thanks. All right, so here we have the different. It's a review, so relax. Okay, so you'll see here that there's the different elements of plot, starting out with the exposition. What's the exposition?
The character setting.
Yep, character setting,
Situation or
and the beginning of that situation. Okay, what about the rising action? What's rising action? Cheyenne, what's rising action? Yeah, the development of the conflict, absolutely. What about climax? What happens there? Royce, what's climax?
Climax is the thing, when the story reaches all the way up to the point, like, to the main situation.
Yes, what else can we call that?
We call that.
The conflict, the main conflict, okay? What about the resolution? What happens there? Ariel, what happens in the resolution? Yeah, the conflict starts to get resolved, right? And then lastly, what happens when we like completely end the story? True. But like, what is like that piece called?
Is that the resolution?
The resolution is, well, technically falling action is like when it starts to come to a close, and then our resolution would be like the absolute closing of the entire story. Okay. Okay, so thinking about these things, how can plot influence style? I want you to take a second, I want you to write that down in your notes, your own opinion, and we'll talk about it. How can plot influence style?
So you have to put that in
Well, it's
Yep.
probably.
Same.
I want you to write it down in your notes.
How do you plot what?
Influence style.
Wait, oh.
You talking about like our style?
No, the style of the author.
Right, okay.
stalking people's papers. I saw some really good ideas. What do you guys think? How can your plot of a story influence like the author's style? How do those two things go together? Bernicia, what do you think? Yeah, absolutely, right? So the way that the author describes the character and leads into the story, both has a lot to do with their style. What else did we say about this? What else do we think? Yeah.
Like, what a story started, like if they was in a bad mood and they said it was a dark stormy night, something like that.
Yeah, right? So like the author's own emotions and own way that they write is gonna influence the story, right? You're not gonna be like a dark person and write like this happy, sunshiny story necessarily. Really good point, really good point. So, what I want us to do is take a second and look on the right side of that page, on page 23. We talked a little bit about these elements here, foreshadowing and flashback, but here's an element of foreshadowing right here for us. So what I want you to do is with the person next to you, or alone if you so choose, I want you to read through this passage, and I want you to tell me, like, in your own words, how would you describe the author's style? You're not gonna read the whole story, just this one passage, right? Just this one little passage from the story. How would you describe the author's style? Write it down. Make sure you're writing down anything that you come up with in your notes. Like Josue said, he thinks it's detailed, so you would write that down. That's a good justification. Alright, take about 30 seconds and make sure that you have some sort of idea about how you describe this style. Alright, let's bring it back together. So, from looking at this passage, and you guys are obviously familiar with this story, how would you describe the author's style? What do you guys think? Yeah.
I feel like he uses like a lot of sensory language to help you to like be able to see stuff like, cause he's like real like descriptive and detailed, and he helps you to like imagine the curiosity, all the questions they ask you and stuff like that.
Yeah, that's a lot of good details. Give us some examples of where you see some sensory language.
Okay, like at the last sentence, he said, the glass tapped against his strong teeth, so it helps you to imagine like the man's teeth and stuff like that, and somewhat of like what he would look like.
Yeah, absolutely. And what I really love that Ramika did, and I want to hear some other interpretations too, and this is going to be your expectation as well, is when you're telling me about style, you're not just telling me like, okay, I think his style is this. You're telling me how you know that and why you think that, right? Which is what she did. She told us like, I think that because he uses a lot of sensory language, and I know that because of this example, right? Which is awesome. Anybody else have like a different interpretation or way of looking at this? Yeah.
Just like she said, he's like detailed, shows what each one of the characters are doing.
Okay.
Just like in the first paragraph, wait, we on page 23.
Yep.
He said, he took something out of his pocket and proffered it to Miss White, drew back with his grimace, but her son taking it examined it curiously.
Yep.
So it's showing what the boy did or the guy did to Miss White, and what is the little boy saying and doing. Yeah, he's examining like his paw and stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. Good.
I got it.
Darnisha, how would you describe the point of view of the story? What point of view is it written in? Third what? Omniscient. Why do we say omniscient? Yeah, it's the narrator here knows everything about all these characters. Awesome. So what we're gonna do with the rest of the time is you guys are gonna be practicing doing this for a lot of different, which is about like 10-ish, 15 minutes. You're gonna be doing this for different types of passages. So I pulled out short passages, only about 2 or 3 sentences, from different stories as well as poems. Now, before I give this to you, thinking about knowing what you know about author style, do you think that author style is gonna be, the way we talk about it, is gonna be the same for literature as well as poetry? The same for stories and poetry? What do you think? Is style going to be the same for poetry as well as literature?
I mean, couldn't it?
It can be, right? It definitely can be. Just like when we were talking about style in here, like some of you guys said, like you have really similar style. Like I remember Naya's group over here was talking about how like they both have expensive style, right? Like they like expensive things. That's totally true for authors. Some authors have really similar style, whether it's poetry or it's stories. However, could it be different? Yeah. Right? Like when we're talking poetry and we're talking stories, they use different devices, right? They're written in different ways, they use different language, different structure. So that's gonna also play a role in how we think about and how we describe the style. Okay, I want you to keep that in the back of your mind. So just to set some expectations, I'm gonna pass this out to you. I put the directions up here, but they're also on your packet. So what you're gonna be doing is looking at these different short excerpts, and you're going to be telling me what you believe the author's style is. Is Elijah always going to have the same answer as Christian? No, right? Like you guys can describe it in different ways. What makes a good answer and an answer that gets full credit is an answer that is able to back it up, right? So if you want to make the argument that's like totally different than maybe how I would read it, that's okay, but you better be able to back it up and prove it. And the way that you do that is you're going to tell me how did they achieve that style, right? What did they use? Was it their sentence structure? Was it the type of words they chose? What was it? The literary devices? How did they use them? And then lastly, give me some specific evidence from the text to back it up. Okay. Are there questions about what you're supposed to be doing right now?
There you go.
Thank you. I'll grab those in a second. Okay. So I'm going to give you guys about the next 10 to 12 minutes to check in about this, and then we will come back together. Thank you. I want you to get through at least like the next 4 of these.